You're listening to Earth Keepers, a podcast for all of us who believe that Earth care is faith practice. In our honest conversations, you'll hear fresh perspectives and practical insights that help us to care for the planet and love our places. So friends, get ready for a fascinating conversation, one that is so full of insight and encouragement, in fact, that we are going to split it into 2 different episodes. Our guest is well-known author, journalist, and environmentalist Bill McKibben. His writing has appeared in countless publications like The New Yorker and Rolling Stone, and he has written many books over the last few decades. Personally speaking, these books have had an enormous shaping influence on my life, and I have found ways to incorporate them into my graduate teaching whenever possible. As most of our listeners know, Circlewood works in loving collaborative partnership with A Rocha USA, an organization that, like Circlewood, is devoted to helping people to live into their shared calling to care for God's creation. Among other things, Circlewood and A Rocha are committed to co-creating a number of podcast episodes this year, and this episode is one of those collaborative endeavors. For that reason, the conversation with Bill McKibben will be co-hosted by my friend James Amadon, Executive Director of Circlewood, and by Deb Rienstra, a writer, speaker, and professor who serves on A Rocha USA's advisory board. I should note, too, that Dr. Rienstra has been a podcast guest in the past, and I would urge you to check out my conversation with her in episode 85 of Earth Keepers. So, here we go with part 1 of our podcast conversation with Bill McKibben. In this episode, Bill challenges us and inspires us by his own experiences of the sort of truth-speaking and teaching that leads people into hands-on climate action. He also helps us to understand that now that wind and solar energy are cheaper to produce than energy from fossil fuels, it has become much easier to make the economic case for a global shift towards cheap, clean energy and away from reliance on increasingly expensive, environmentally destructive oil that is at the root of so much geopolitical conflict these days. Now, as we begin our conversation, I should give you a heads up. While Bill was participating in this conversation from his home in the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont, a huge and beautiful thunderstorm rose up in the background and would not be ignored. Indeed, rather than edit that out in production, we chose to welcome the sounds of the storm as a sort of fourth voice in the conversation. So, welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast.
Bill, it is so great to have you with us. James and I have been looking forward to this.
Great to be here, old friend, and great to get to meet you, James.
We wanted to start by thinking about place and by asking you about your relationship to place. So I know that you've lived in Southern California, you've lived in the Boston area for a while, and now you've been in Vermont for quite a while. What do you love about Vermont? How are you connected to this as a place?
I should say I only lived in Southern California till I was 5, so I have vague memories, but they're beautiful, and many of them are of the house in Altadena where I grew up that burned down on day 2 of the big LA fire. When I got out of college, I moved to New York City, which I loved and explored at great depth because I was writing the Talk of the Town column for The New Yorker. At one point, my boast was that I'd gotten out in every subway station in New York City, which has more subway stations than the rest of North America combined. When I was 26, I moved to the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, the greatest wilderness of the American East. And I've spent the rest of my life between the Adirondacks and Vermont, so either side of Lake Champlain in the mountains. Now I live on the edge of the Green Mountain National Forest, right on the spine of the Green Mountains in Vermont.
Do you think of yourself as a mountain guy?
I do. It's interesting. My little brother grew up in the same suburbs I did, moved to Maine and became an ocean guy. He's a lobster fisherman on an island far off the coast in Penobscot Bay. And so it's great. I can go visit him and get some salt water, and he can come up and breathe in the scent of the balsams.
James, you're a forest guy, right?
I am. I grew up not that far from Bill in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and now find myself spending most of my time in a 40-acre forest here on Camano Island, just north of Seattle. So just feel very much at home and at peace when I'm in the woods.
Your turn, Deb.
Oh, I think I'm a dune girl. Freshwater lakes, can't beat it. I also like a good weedy field.
I got to say, I remember once being up on those dunes sort of near Traverse City in your part of the world, where the dunes went straight into the forest. I really had never seen anything quite like it. You could stand in ankle-deep white sand in the woods and look out over this dune down to the lake. It was pretty spectacular.
Yeah, you're experiencing forest succession. So there are certain plants that grow on dunes while they're still moving, and then there are certain plants that continue in the succession to stabilize the dunes. And Sleeping Bear, which is probably where you were, Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, you can see all those stages of succession. It's beautiful.
Well, it's really a privilege to meet you and through this medium, Bill. And I've been an admirer of yours for a long time and feel a kinship with you around that shared love for New England. Also, I have benefited so much from your work. Your books have helped me. I have Here Comes the Sun right next to me, which I know we're going to get to talk about in just a little bit. I just find your Substack work through the crucial years absolutely vital to my work, and I am sharing it all the time. I tell people that they're full of wisdom, wit, clarity, and what really strikes me and what I love about your work is that they're grounded in passion and commitment, integrity, but also a kindness and a sense of humility. And I admire that a lot because you've been at it for so long. You've spent a long time as an organizer, an activist for the environment, for related issues of environmental and social justice. And I know that work has changed over the years. And I'm thinking that people, especially nowadays, come to all of these issues with different beliefs and attitudes, commitments, motivations. And over the years, I'm sure you've employed many different strategies to reach a wide swath of people over these really crucial issues. And I'm curious, from your vantage point, your work right now, what strategies seem to be working at the moment?
One of the basic facts of this whole climate and energy debate has changed in the course of this decade. For the first 35 years of the climate fight, and you're right, I've been doing this a long time. I'm an old man. I wrote the first book about what we then called the greenhouse effect back in the 1980s. For the first 35 years of this fight, we lived in a world where fossil fuel was relatively cheap and clean energy relatively expensive. And that dictated the ways that we could battle, A lot of work was done on things like carbon taxes to try and make fossil fuel more expensive. We did these huge pipeline fights to stop the consolidation of this industry, the massive and successful efforts around divestment from fossil fuel to drive up their cost of capital, on and on. Those things were all important and continue to be important. But now we have the force of economic gravity working in our favor. About 5 years ago, we crossed some invisible line where it became cheaper to produce power from the sun and the wind than from setting stuff on fire. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal anthropologically. I mean, humans have been setting stuff on fire for 700,000 years. And Darwin said that language and fire were the two things that marked our species apart, But it's also a big deal in that it means we have a scalable weapon finally to use in what is very much a real fight, hopefully a peaceful one, but a very real one, to try and transition us off the fossil fuel that is destroying the planet's climate system in real time. Though it helped immensely and we got a lot done, simply asking people to care for the future, to care for creation, to follow the dictates of their conscience was not enough to produce change on the scale that was required. Now we have another tool to really help, and especially since it's a tool that helps not just with the climate fight, but with one of the other huge issues of our moment, affordability, and truthfully, that also helps with the other crisis of the moment, the crisis of authoritarianism, because fascism and fossil fuel are more tightly linked than we sometimes remember, and certainly the case in our country at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the case that you lay out in Here Comes the Sun. And I was taken actually by how optimistic you were in the book, considering a former book was called The End of Nature.
Well, yes, I mean, the thing is, all the things that I talked about in The End of Nature in the 1980s have now happened. And the damage is brutal and ongoing and scary every moment. I mean, in the last 3 weeks, there's been a huge amount of new science detailing just how imminent the threat to the Gulf Stream and the other huge currents of the Atlantic are as melting freshwater pours off Greenland, changing the salinity and hence the density of water in the North Atlantic, and that's what drives those giant conveyor belts. The estimate of the leading scientist in this field, Johan Rockström, last week was that there is a 50% chance that they'll collapse in the decades ahead. So there's endless amount of bad news, but there's no use weeping over the things we've already done. Now we have a tool to keep things from getting worse than they have to. It's not going to stop global warming, even if we do everything right at this point. But we are finally in a position to start shaving tenths of a degree off how hot the planet gets. And if that doesn't sound like much, at this point, every tenth of a degree Celsius that we raise the temperature moves 100 million of our brothers and sisters from a safe climate zone to a perilous one. So this is the most important work that it's possible to be doing right now.
Well, I find it interesting that your optimism is around the speed of which a transition to renewable energy can now happen. And I was really intrigued in the book about how you tied that to other issues such as economics, democracy, and all of those kind of things. We can make technological changes, and they're not going to solve everything, but they might mitigate some of the consequences. But what happens if we do that without the underlying cultural changes that are needed to live differently? Wondering how you understand in this moment the relationship between technology and culture.
Sure. Those are very good and deep questions, and I've spent a lot of my life thinking about them. I wrote a book some years ago called Deep Economy that was a real attempt to get around questions of growth and what they mean. So I think the deepest conclusion I came to in writing that book was that economic growth as a paradigm comes up short not only on environmental grounds, but also on the grounds, and maybe even predominantly, that it makes us less happy than it claims to. I think humans were built for contact with the natural world and contact with each other. I think those are the things that give us the deepest satisfactions. And I think that 100 years from now, we'll probably live very different lives as a result of that. But do I think that's going to happen in 5 or 6 years, in the period of time that's relevant to whether or not we're able to save the climate system? I don't. I think that consumerism is a virus that's taken pretty deep hold. 100 million human beings enter the consuming class now each year on this planet, most of them in Asia. And my guess is that most of them are going to follow at least some way down the path that you and I have trod in the Western world. So I think it's imperative that we figure out some ways to accommodate that without wrecking creation. And I think that the move towards sun and wind is, well, I think it's subversive, or it can be, in that these are smaller scale, more local ways to produce one of the two most vital commodities that we use, and that therefore they offer at least the possibility of beginning to resize and rescale our cultures and our economies. I can't think of anything much more subversive that humans could be doing right now in order to change our culture. Because I don't think culture changes because people write books about it or whatever. I think it changes in large part in reaction to conditions. I mean, just think about it at the moment. You know, our president, who I think, I'll just lay my cards on the table, I think is a clueless idiot and has gotten us involved in a war in Iran without any idea what it was about or how to get us out of it or what it meant or anything else. But I think that he's done us one big favor in the process, which is demonstrate that the world doesn't want to rely on a commodity that can be bottled up behind a 20-mile-long waterway someplace. Sunlight has to travel 93 million miles to reach the Earth, but none of those miles go through the Strait of Hormuz. So the transition in this case, which is now starting to happen very quickly in other parts of the world, the transition is not just about energy, it's about geopolitics. I mean, think how many wars could have been averted in the last century had oil been of trivial value in that period. Humans, as we all know, are much too good at coming up with ways to fight wars, but figuring out how to fight one over sunshine will be a battle, I think. And so in many counts, I think that this is potentially a subversive change. At any rate, it's a necessary one. So we need to do it. I'm old enough that at some level I can say my job is to do what I can to preserve a world where people who come after have some kind of options about how they're going to live and what things are going to look like. And this is clearly a necessary step in that process.
Yeah. So this raises interesting questions about technology and spirituality and culture change. If you're right that the practical leads the cultural or the value, that puts us in faith communities in a weird position because we always seem to think that the value drives the practice. And in a way, that's very noble, but it isn't actually how things work. So if we are in need of this technological transition, which we certainly are, what is the role of faith communities in changing, preserving the sort of underlying values? Because we have been all in on growth and domination and all of this stuff. How, as implicated and complicit as we are, can we still be participants in these deeper spiritual transitions and maybe even leaders?
Well, I mean, I think actually that this is one of these cases where the two things go hand in hand. Figuring out how to lead and help on technological change and on values change. So I was in Rome in September. The new Pope had summoned a bunch of us over. I'm not a Roman Catholic, I'm a Methodist, but he'd summoned a bunch of people over for a conference to mark the 10th anniversary of Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si, which is a document about values, and it's probably the most important document so far this millennium. A thoroughgoing critique of modernity delivered in very powerful prose. In the process, the Pope started a huge dialogue within his church. There's now a large Laudato Si movement. In fact, we were at the building they built on the grounds of the papal summer palace, Castle Gandolfo, that's now the headquarters of the Laudato Si movement. While we were there, the Pope gave his talk, and by the way, he's a bizarrely normal, older, Midwestern American guy, you know? Like if he showed up at your Thanksgiving table, you would just think your bachelor uncle had wandered in from somewhere. He's completely normal, which was quite bizarre for an American, you know, but very nice. I really liked him. He said, we're going to follow all Francis' teachings on climate change and keep hard at work on this. And then he said, and sometime in 2026, we're flipping the switch on this big solar farm that we've built outside Rome, at which point the Vatican will become the first fully solar-powered nation on planet Earth, which is very cool. And so when it was my turn to talk, I said, you know, thank you, Your Holiness, this is excellent news. And it suggests what our mantra for fighting this political battle going forward should be, you know, energy from heaven, not from hell. And so I don't know how you unlink questions around practical change and values change. It's possible that the Catholic Church has been better than the rest of Christendom at kind of integrating practical and values questions in a lot of ways. You know, when we started Third Act to organize old people like me, one of the groups we have is called Third Act Faith, and it's mostly retired clergy of all faiths and denominations. And they're working hard on these solar bills that we have in 28 state legislatures this spring. And they're doing it from a values perspective, but it's entirely practical. We're trying to get permitting reform to make it cheaper to put solar panels on the roof. We're trying to get states to legalize this so-called plug-in solar or balcony solar that has spread so quickly across Western Europe in the last 3 years, but remains, well, until a few weeks ago, illegal in the U.S. Now it's legal not only in Utah, but I think we'll have 10 states by the end of the spring. So this is all work that we need to do. I don't know how you draw the line between secular and sacred work in this, because it all at some level seems to be about creation and about love of one's neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a matter of communication. It's a matter of persuasion. So being a part of some of these groups, including A Rocha and the Rocha cohort program, and I'm actually part of Third Act Faith on the coordinating committee, and also have relationships with a lot of these other groups that are trying to work with churches to do the practical stuff. But do you begin with, it'll save you money? Do you begin with, no, this is our calling? I think you'd mix it all up together.
I think you do. And I think the other place we can also begin is just how beautiful the prospect is, I mean, look, at the moment, our energy system is the farthest thing from beautiful. 9 million people a year die on this planet from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. But that's 1 death in 5 on our planet. There are 5 million school children in New Delhi in India. 2.5 million of them have irreversible lung damage from breathing the air. That's, at this point, a choice. Do we want to have that kind of system, or do we want to have the kind that takes the gift that God gives us every single day, the sun that shines down, the breeze that washes across the planet? Do we want to take those and make full use of them? So the simple fact that it's beautiful and human, I think, is important. We don't know how prehistoric humans thought about things. They, being prehistoric, failed to write it down. But every time they built something out of rock like Stonehenge, it pointed to the solstice or the equinox. The minute that we started making myths, the first thing that people had to explain was, how does this thing rise over here in the morning, set over here in the afternoon, and get back over here the next morning? I'm not suggesting that we engage in sun worship. I mean, I'm, more of the kind of SON worship type. But I have extraordinary affection for the sun. It's the most charismatic object in our corner of the universe. It already gives us light and warmth, and via photosynthesis our supper. Now it's willing to provide us with all the power we could ever need. And when I say sun, of course, I mean the wind as well. It's just a function of the fact that the sun heats the earth differentially, creating the breezes that turn those majestic turbines. I think you lead with whatever works in the community you're in, But just the fact that the very, very first page of Genesis, God was busily talking about the wind that was blowing across the surface and the sun that was separating the light from the dark, and on and on and on, should give us some kind of clue that we have this stuff to work with, and we should. It doesn't require us to hate on the people who, mined coal for 100 years, because no one had invented the solar cell yet. My family all comes from West Virginia. Thank heaven people figured that out and, built us modernity on the back of it. But we don't need it anymore, and it's causing us huge problems. So time to move on.
It's important to remember that we can appreciate and admire things like the sun and think how cool they are. That's not the same as worship. Sometimes people get all excited and think, oh, well, you're going to worship. No, you're appreciating and loving something that God created, and finding, as you say, ways to make life better for everybody, humans, but also the more than human world, by actually engaging with the creation better.
Truthfully, I think at this point, there are more people who seem set on worshiping coal and gas and oil. I went down some years ago to Louisiana, to the second biggest Baptist seminary in the country, and there was the right-wing anti-environmental Christian guy who was my debate adversary, but he was at one point reduced to arguing that coal and gas and oil were in the ground the same way that Jesus had been in the ground after the crucifixion, and so they were rising up again. And he did say quite clearly, God gave us coal and gas and oil to use, which fine, but God gave us the sun and the wind to use. And there it is, and it's incredibly easy to get at now. I mean, Think about what you have to do if you want to get some oil, if you want to drive your car on gasoline. You have to be able to drill for oil a mile beneath the ocean and bring it up and refine it, get it to a gas station and put it in the engine of your car where thousands of moving parts coordinate the explosion of the pistons in the cylinders every second. And, only about 30% of the energy even gets used to move the car down the road. Most is just wasted as heat. I have solar panels on my roof. They plug into my EV in the garage. There's 20 moving parts in the engine. That's it. It couldn't be easier. I've been using for a decade now one of these induction cooktops that you can get for $60 online. Not only does it boil water twice as fast as the gas in the... we've got a good thunderstorm kicking off here in the
Are
mountains.
you okay?
I'm great. I love
Okay.
thunderstorm.
Thinking how appropriate it is to this
Yes,
conversation.
it's fantastic. Not only does it boil water faster, if you have an open fire in your kitchen, your kid has a 50% greater chance of coming down with asthma. These are very, very easy switches that we're being called on to make. I think sometimes for environmentalists, it feels almost too easy, some of it, You don't have to wear a hair shirt. You don't have to dramatically change everything you're doing. You have to do the work to get the furnace out of your basement and put a heat pump in so that you can heat and cool your house with a quarter as much energy, and that energy can come from the sun and the wind. We've been given an extraordinary gift right now at exactly the last possible moment. And what a sin to waste it. And if I can add, we've been speaking as good Christians should in a kind of universal language, but let's just talk as Americans for a minute. All this stuff was invented here. The solar cell was invented in Edison, New Jersey in 1956 at Bell Labs. The first industrial wind turbine was in 1943, 20 miles due south of me in the mountains of Vermont. We're just handing this stuff lock, stock, and barrel over to our theoretical main adversary, who we used to call the godless communists in China. I don't think there's ever been an act of national economic self-sabotage quite on a par with it. The suburb that I grew up in was Lexington, Massachusetts. So I spent my summers giving tours of the battle green where the American Revolution began. So my sense of patriotism is fairly well ingrained and deeply grounded, and it pisses me off on that front too, I gotta say. You've got me sermonizing here, and
Well, your comments are punctuated by thunder. It's appropriate.
It's a prophetic voice. That's why. It's that prophetic voice.
So, friends, that was the first part of our conversation with author Bill McKibben. Check out the show notes for this episode if you want to know more about him and what he's up to these days. Now, for me, the most provocative thing Bill said in this conversation was this: the most important work that we can be doing is the subversive work of moving ourselves and our communities away from dependence on fossil fuels and toward reliance on sun and wind energy. Bill makes the case that any and all of us can take part in this work by aggressively shifting our own energy use and embracing new clean energy technologies in our personal lives. Importantly, he claims that we needn't and shouldn't do this work entirely on our own, but instead seek ways to join with others in coordinated efforts to change the communities where we live. If you were as inspired by Bill's challenges as I was, a great place to start exploring practical responses is to check out a couple of organizations that Bill is involved in. Most recently, he founded Third Act, which organizes and mobilizes people over the age of 60 for action on climate justice. He also helped found 350.org, the first global grassroots climate campaign, which has organized protests to promote climate action on every continent, including Antarctica. You might also want to check out opportunities with our partner organization, A Rocha USA, represented in this conversation by Deb Rienstra, who is on their advisory board. Check out our show notes for other resources that we recommend when it comes to collective action and community organization for the good of the planet. The point of all this, of course, is to simply take hold of the truth that you and every one of us in the Earthkeepers community have the capacity to get involved and work for change now. As Bill put it, shifting our lives toward reliance on sun and wind power makes environmental, economic, and moral sense in ways that can no longer be denied. And because clean energy has become so cheap and accessible, there's never been a time of such opportunity as the one we're living in now. So, how can we not take action at such a time as this?